Would you like to make a podcast? Spotify has a way to let you make one easily, distribute it everywhere, and even earn money, all in one place, for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit right from your phone or computer, so you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are heard. And video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free. You know, ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I've enjoyed sharing my favorite stories with children around the world. If you've ever thought of starting your own podcast, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started. Welcome to Bedtime Stories. Please make sure you press follow to get notified of new stories and leave a rating. If you enjoyed today's story, forward it to a friend. And now, the tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse. Once upon a time there was a wood mouse, and her name was Mrs. Tittlemouse. She lived in a bank under a hedge. Such a funny house. There were yards and yards of sandy passages, leading to storerooms and nut cellars and seed cellars, all amongst the roots of the hedge. There was a kitchen, a parlor, and a pantry. Also, there was Mrs. Tittlemouse's bedroom, where she slept in a little box bed. Mrs. Tittlemouse was the most terribly tidy, particular little mouse, always sweeping and dusting the soft sandy floors. Sometimes a beetle lost its way in the passages. "Shoo, shoo, little dirty feet," said Mrs. Tittlemouse, clattering her dustpan. Another day, a big fat spider came in to shelter from the rain. "Beg your pardon, is this not Miss Muffet's? Go away, you bold bad spider, leaving ends of cobwebs all over my nice clean floors." She bundled the spider out of the window, and he let himself down the hedge with a long thin bit of string. Mrs. Tittlemouse went on her way to a distant storeroom to fetch cherry stones and thistledown seed for dinner. All along the passage she sniffed and looked at the floor. "I smell a smell of honey. Is it the cowslips outside, in the hedge? I am sure I can see the marks of little dirty feet." Suddenly, around the corner, she met Babbity Bumble. "Bzz, bzz," said the bumblebee. Mrs. Tittlemouse looked at her sternly. She wished she had a broom. "Good day, Babbity Bumble. I should be glad to buy some beeswax. But what are you doing down here? Why do you always come in at a window and say bzz bzz?" Mrs. Tittlemouse began to get angry. "Bzz bzz," replied Babbity Bumble in a peevish squeak. She sidled down the passage and disappeared into a storeroom which had been used for acorns. Mrs. Tittlemouse had eaten acorns before Christmas. The storeroom ought to have been empty, but it was full of untidy dry moss. Mrs. Tittlemouse began to pull out the moss. 3 or 4 other bees put their heads out and buzzed fiercely. "I am not in the habit of letting guests stay in my house. This is an intrusion," said Mrs. Tittlemouse. "I will have them turned out. I wonder who will help me. I will not have Mr. Jackson. He never wipes his feet." Mrs. Tittlemouse decided to leave the bees until after dinner. When she got back to the parlor, she heard someone coughing in a fat voice. And there sat Mr. Jackson himself. He was sitting all over a small rocking chair, twiddling his thumbs and smiling, with his feet on the fender. He lived in a drain below the hedge, in a very dirty wet ditch. "How do you do, Mr. Jackson? You are very wet." "Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. I'll sit a while and dry myself," said Mr. Jackson. He sat and smiled, and water dripped off his coat-tails. Mrs. Tittlemouse went around him with a mop. He sat for such a while that she had to ask if he'd like to stay for dinner. First, she offered him cherry stones. "Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. No teeth," said Mr. Jackson. He opened his mouth most unnecessarily wide. He certainly had not a tooth in his head. Then she offered him thistledown seed. And with a large sneeze, Mr. Jackson blew thistledown all over the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. Now what I would really like would be a little dish of honey." "I'm afraid I do not have any, Mr. Jackson," said Mrs. Tittlemouse. "Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse," said the smiling Mr. Jackson. "I can smell it. That's why I came over." Mr. Jackson rose from the table and began to look into the cupboards. Mrs. Tittlemouse followed him with a dishcloth to wipe his large wet footmarks off the parlor floor. When he had convinced himself that there was no honey in the cupboards, he began to walk down the passage. "Indeed, indeed, you will stick fast, Mr. Jackson. Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse." First he squeezed into the pantry. "Tiddly widdly widdly. No honey. No honey, Mrs. Tittlemouse." But there were 3 creepy-crawly people hiding in the plate rack. 2 of them got away, but the littlest one he caught. Then he squeezed into the larder. Mrs. Butterfly was tasting the sugar, but she flew away out the window. "Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse. You seem to have plenty of visitors." "And without invitation," said Mrs. Tittlemouse. They went along the sandy passage. He met Babbity around the corner and snapped her up and put her down again. "I do not like bumblebees. They have bristles all over," said Mr. Jackson, wiping his mouth with his coat sleeve. "Get out, you nasty toad!" shrieked Babbity Bumble. "I shall go," said Miss Tittlemouse. She shut herself up in a nut cellar, while Mr. Jackson pulled out the bee's nest. He seemed to have no objection to stings. When Miss Tittlemouse ventured to come out, everybody had gone away. But the untidiness was something dreadful. Never did I see such a mess. Smears of honey and moss and thistledown, and marks of big and little dirty feet all over my nice clean house. She gathered up the moss and remains of the beeswax. Then she went out and fetched some twigs to partly close up the front door. "I will make it too small for Mr. Jackson." She fetched soft soap and a flannel and a new scrub brush from the storeroom, but she was too tired to do any more. First, she fell asleep in her chair, and then she went to bed. "Will it ever be tidy again?" said poor Mrs. Tittlemouse. The next morning she got up very early and began her spring cleaning, which lasted 2 weeks. She swept and scrubbed and dusted, and she rubbed up the furniture with beeswax, and polished her little tin spoons. When it was all beautiful, neat, and clean, she gave a party to 5 other little mice, without Mr. Jackson. He smelled the party and came up from the bank, but he could not squeeze in the door. So they handed him out acorn cupfuls of honeydew through the window, and he was not offended. He sat outside in the sun and said, "Tiddly widdly widdly." "Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse." Thank you for listening to Bedtime Stories. Please make sure you press follow to get notified of new stories and leave a rating. If you enjoyed today's story, forward it to a friend. If you have a suggestion for a new story, send us an email, magicmonorail@gmail.com. Until next time, good night.